You may have been too stressed at work to hear, but the World Health Organization recently added burnout to its classification of diseases as, quote, an occupational phenomenon. Burnout is not new, of course, but it's more widespread than ever and hitting people of every generation. With us now for more, in Paris, France, via Skype, Rahaf Harfouch, Executive Director of the Red Thread Institute of Digital Culture and author of Hustle and Float: Reclaim Your Creativity and Thrive in a World Obsessed with Work. And here in our studio, Dr. Katy Kamkar, clinical psychologist with the Work, Stress and Health Program at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And Katy, it's good to have you back on the program. You've been here many times before. Ms. Harfouch, good to have you on the line all the way over in Paris, France. Let me just, as we start here, this is only as of May 28. The World Health Organization added this checklist of things to the occupational phenomenon of burnout. Feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, or reduced professional efficacy. Dr. Kamkar, can you explain to us what is particularly new about this new understanding or definition of burnout?
I am so happy that we are finally really giving more importance and acknowledgement and recognition to burnout. Because when we talk about, especially in terms of the costs associated with mental health in Canada, $51 billion annually, which we know are going to increase by the year 2021. And a large bulk of it is really associated with mental health disabilities, absenteeism, reduced productivity, short-term and long-term care disability. What we really need to look here at what are the modifiable factors that are contributing towards the exacerbation or maintenance of any mental health problems, including physical health problems, but anything that has a strong impact on our work. Burnout is certainly a key one. It has a significant impact on our health, physical health and mental health, and definitely our work performance. And as you mentioned, these are the key indicators of burnout. When we talk about exhaustion, so it's really the emotional, psychological, physical, psychological, especially psychological and emotional exhaustion, the sense of depersonalization or cynicism. And that's what's interesting about this, is when we start losing our sense of self, when we start having emotions or thoughts that we feel are not necessarily connected to the self anymore. And then also there's this growing distrust of others. So it's really around that feeling that others are maybe to get at me. So, but especially whenever there's distrust that takes place, we can certainly imagine the growing interpersonal relationships that might also occur.
Let's see if that checklist jibes with the experience of Rahaf in Paris, France, because you experienced burnout firsthand. So how much of what Dr. Kamkar just had to say jibes with your understanding and experience of it?
Oh, so much of it. It's as though she was reading a list of my own symptoms. I mean, I also have to add, I experienced myself extreme physical symptoms. I had hair loss. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I had a difficult time doing cognitive tasks. And the best way to describe it would be, if I tried to think about something or do something work related, it would be as though I was reaching into an empty space. I genuinely thought that I had damaged my mental capacity to think and problem solve and create permanently. That's how intense and terrible it was during the time.
And what do you think brought it on?
I just overwork, an unrelenting pressure to constantly produce, to be busy, to justify every moment of your day, to broadcast how important you are through how stuffed your calendar is, or how many calls you're on, or how many emails are coming in. It's this social narrative where we've almost developed a new cultural language whereby we communicate to each other our worthiness of needing to be at work, our worthiness of our jobs and identities through this posturing, through talking about how tired we are and how overworked we are.
And Rahaf, why did you feel that just sort of dialing it down a few degrees was not an option?
I mean, I think if it was that easy, this wouldn't be a global epidemic. I think often when we talk about burnout, we focus on the physical symptoms and we focus on, oh, people are working too much. And a lot of the research that I have done really focuses on unpackaging the cultural stories that we tell ourselves about success, about hard work. So for many people, it's not just about, oh, work a little less, sleep a little more, take more breaks, but it's having these very intense conversations about self-worth worth and ego and, again, being worthy, being enough, how people are seeing you and how you see yourself. So it's not as simple as telling somebody, oh, just work a little less hours.
Dr. Kamkar, how familiar does all of this sound as it relates to the people that you see in your practice?
Absolutely all. And she makes a very great point by really also distinguishing between, often when we hear stress and anxiety versus pressure, it is very pressure, the constant ongoing progressing pressure that can become very disabling. You know, when we look at, again, burnout, the loss of energy and the fatigue, very different from, for example, clinical depression or other anxiety disorders. These are, so the exhaustion here from burnout is very separate. It's also accompanied by insomnia or this immense difficulty to even recover. But when we look at also burnout overall, it's a sense of loss. It's a sense of loss in so many areas of our life. It's interesting because a lot of research also has found how there are especially loss in our personal resources that could lead to increased risk for burnout. So for example, participation or skill utilization or professional worth. So for example, participation, do we feel that we are able to participate in some key decisions that might be going on in our organization? Skill utilization, do we perceive that we are able to use a variety of skills to be able to do our work and our responsibilities? And most importantly, professional worth, do we feel that our work is recognized, is being valued? And most importantly, do I feel that my work is consistent with the organizational goal? Because as soon as we lose this, there's also this reward that we are losing, and it also comes to job insecurity as well.
Well, let me share a bunch of words here with you, and you tell me if these are basically all different sides of the same cube, because they may be used interchangeably. Burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, depression. What's the relationship here?
They're all related. So I think this is important to know. They're all related. And certainly burnout is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing event. It's a progression. And certainly it can increase the risk for psychological disorders, so such as clinical depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., but also physical health problems. And there's also an overlap between physical health and mental health as well. Now, it's also possible to suffer from a mental health condition, psychological disorder, concurrent with burnout. And of course, burnout can just contribute to the exacerbation and chronicity and make a recovery even more prolonged. What's also very interesting throughout research is really when we look at key organizational, as she also very greatly discussed, when we look at key organizational stressors, so for example, a role within organization, supervisory relationship, organizational structure and climate, rewards, or stressors intrinsic to the job, we can see how all of those, more or less, or sometimes one component more than the other, can also increase the risk for burnout.
I'm going to read something now, Rahaf, that the American psychiatrist Richard A. Friedman wrote about burnout in the New York Times, and then I'll get you to react to it after I finish reading this excerpt from his piece. When a disorder is reportedly so widespread, it makes me wonder whether we are at risk of medicalizing everyday distress. If almost everyone suffers from burnout, then no one does, and the concept loses all credibility. Of course, we must do all we can to detect and treat serious mental illness, like depression and drug and alcohol abuse. But let's not medicalize everyday stress and discomfort as burnout. Okay, you want to react to that?
I mean, for me, I took the opposite view when I saw how global this epidemic was. It signified to me not that, not that it reflects that we're minimizing someone's mental conditions, but actually the opposite, that the systems that we have created around work, and my research particularly focuses on creative work and knowledge work, that if so many people are signaling that they are in distress, then to me, that is a huge red flag that we as a society and that organizations themselves and leadership teams need to actually start looking at the design of the system, the cultures of the organization. And that is, I think, a conversation that we need to be having more. It worries me to see people dismiss it, because I know that when I was experiencing my own burnout, you feel ashamed. We have a culture where hard work is a symbol of your ability to own your role, of your ability to do a good job. And so if you can't do that job, if you can't hustle hard enough, you feel a lot of shame because people tell you, or the message that you get culturally is that it's your fault, that you're not working hard enough. You just need a better system. You just need inbox zero. You just need a different framework, instead of actually saying, wait a minute, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we're structuring and designing cultural and the way that we're talking about work within our everyday lives.
Do you share any of your American colleagues' concerns about this?
So here's the thing. When we talk about mental health, the importance of mental health promotion, prevention, we're talking about primary prevention, anything that we do prior to an onset of an illness. Secondary prevention is anything we can help to reduce the onset, certainly minimizing the symptoms whenever there is an onset of an illness. Tertiary prevention, the goal here is to reduce the dysfunction, disability, improve functioning at all levels. And early intervention. We cannot only talk about disorders or an illness. We also need to talk about significant mental health issues, and burnout is a significant one.
Okay, but he's suggesting here that there are too many people who are sort of medicalizing everyday stress here, and that you're medicalizing burnout, which just basically means we need to dial it down a few notches, that's all.
Stress would mean something else, anxiety means also something else, and burnout means something else. So you can definitely experience high level of stress, but not experience burnout. You can experience anxiety, including suffering from an anxiety disorder, and not suffering from burnout. So burnout is very different. And I think that here, as has been exactly mentioned, is the importance, exactly what we are doing here, is to building awareness and continuous education for stigma reduction, but most importantly, to boost psychological well-being, to boost our resiliency, to boost our mental health. And so burnout is a significant mental health issue and correlated, but yet a different construct from depression, from anxiety, and from general life distress that we go through.
Rahaf, I'm going to read you something else now. This was from back in January. BuzzFeed published an article by a reporter named Anne Helen Peterson, who wrote the following: burnout is not limited to workers in acutely high-stress environments, and it's not a temporary affliction. It's the millennial condition. It's our base temperature. It's our background music. It's the way things are. It's our lives. Based on your understanding of this condition, are millennials the burnout generation as she has portrayed it?
I actually think that millennials are not the burnout generation. I think they suffer from burnout, but I think every generation is suffering from these symptoms. The more interesting question to me is, why are these symptoms developing, or what is the underlying narrative that is creating so much of these conditions? And I think what my research has shown is that oftentimes it's not as simple as just saying, oh, this is a generational thing. What we're starting to see is that we have created a lot of promises. Every generation has had its own promise that's being made, that was made about work. So maybe the boomers were promised long-term stability and lifelong careers. The millennials were promised that we could do whatever we wanted, and that every single one of us was very special, and that the world was just waiting for our unique talent. So every generation had this promise that was being made. And now what we're seeing is that automation, new technologies, changes in economic forces, changes in new business models, all of these things have upended many of these promises. And so now you have, boomers and maybe older Gen Xers that are realizing that the career that somebody could have had for 40, 50 years is now no longer an option. Millennials are starting to recognize the realities of working in quite difficult economic conditions after the 2008 financial crisis. So what I believe is that culturally, this is a reaction to a fundamental work promise that was broken, where we have been told in different iterations for each generation, if you work hard enough, you will succeed. We have internalized that as a mantra. And now when so many people are struggling, I think the flip side of that, what we don't talk about enough, is that if you are not succeeding, it must mean that you're not working hard enough. And this goes back to this question of pressure, where we are internalizing the responsibility and the shame and the guilt for not being successful, for not attaining the mythologized standards of success that we see in the news through stories about Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and all of these other greatly successful figures. We take all of that and we say, oh, it must be my fault, so therefore the solution is I have to work harder, when that's not at all the case.
Does burnout transcend generations in your view?
I think that all generations are very different, and so we can definitely compare them, but ultimately they're very different, marked by their own unique stressors. Certainly, there is also this important concept of immense difficulty establishing a balance. It is related to our productivity, performance, and health. And so when we have difficulty establishing balance and we feel it takes its toll, it definitely also is related and or increasing the risk for burnout. Also, what's interesting is also when we look at what are the workplace protective factors, right? Because again, when we start losing those workplace protective factors, we start being more at risk for burnout. So personal workplace efficacy, it's we need to feel confident in our skills.
So the millennials don't have the monopoly on this.
Well, it's you know, again, there could be individual differences, right? But yes, we can feel it in all generations. But again, because of their own unique stressors, it could be felt differently. But we know with burnout, it could be that people might say, you know what, I have done this work for 30 years, but I don't feel I can do it anymore. I don't feel confident in myself. I'm able to do it anymore. So there's this profound sense of reduced self-efficacy, which again, as I mentioned before, it can become very frightening, or being provided with a lot of demands and responsibilities, but with limited support, limited training, limited resources. So over time, so it's not a one-time event, but over time, we feel very much the wear and tear in our system.
Rahaf, I want to just put a couple of expressions from your book to you and have you tell us more about them. The great stretch out and speed up. What does that refer to?
So the great stretch out and the speed up were terms that were originally used during the Industrial Revolution to talk about or to describe underhanded management tactics that used to be used for workers that were working on assembly lines, where what would happen would be the stretch out would be that more responsibilities would be added to an individual's workload without increasing their pay. So somebody who was responsible for one machine might suddenly be responsible for 2 or 3. And then the speed up was when their quota or the number of pieces that they were responsible for creating on that assembly line was drastically increased. So maybe they were responsible for 50 widgets a day, and then suddenly it goes up to 75, and then 100, and then 150. And I use those terms because what we saw during the 2008 financial crisis was the stretch out and the speed up were the same techniques that happened, but this time to white collar workers, to knowledge workers. We saw, because of companies reducing their workforce and letting a lot of people go, we saw more and more people that were taking on additional responsibilities without additional pay. So doing 1.5 jobs, sometimes doing 2 jobs. And then we also saw in many cases that because of the speed of technology, the speed of which we're required to answer and be present and respond to inquiries from clients or from our boss, that the speed up happened where suddenly we have to work faster and faster every day just to keep up. So maybe a lot faster than the jobs that we were doing, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So I wanted to draw the parallels that much of the labor disruptions that happened during the Industrial Revolution, we're now seeing those same constraints and those same strategies, but this time it's the white collar knowledge workers and the creative workers, what I call productive creatives, that are being directly influenced. Because after the recession, when the economy started to recover in 2009, the key factor was many companies did not readjust. So once the economy recovered, companies were not actually hiring people back, and they weren't actually slowing things down. They just thought, oh, this is the new normal, this is the new status quo, and employees were expected to just keep going forward with working more hours and with more responsibilities and at a faster rate.
In which case, Dr. Kamkar, how do you want to change the rules of the workplace in order to prevent more burnout from happening?
So what she's describing is very much, again, as we discussed here earlier, very much tapping into key organizational stressors, and of course also difficulty establishing a balance between our work and personal life. So we need to look at all of those organizational stressors and how finding ways to diminish them.
Like what?
So for example, whenever we are being provided with work demands and responsibilities, ensuring that we have training and resources and education, all the skills to be able to cope with the demands, ensuring that our roles and responsibilities are clearly defined and there's no ambiguity, and also minimizing any role conflict or anytime we might feel that whatever we are assigned is not matching our sense of moral standards and values and so on.
Should we just end I expect you to return my emails even if it's at midnight? Should we end those things?
Well, it definitely would help in terms of the work-life balance. But here also what you're mentioning, which is very important, being provided with, as much as it could be realistically possible and practical, flexible work conditions, because it helps to very much optimize this individualized work-life balance. Certainly, we know that relationships are key. So trust in relationship, transparency, participation, as I mentioned earlier, and definitely rewards. It could be anything. It could be being provided with, again, recognition and acknowledgement and appreciation for what we do, and also ensuring that what we're doing is consistent with the organizational values. But I think the key thing here, as part of building a resiliency, is also the compassion satisfaction. That is very much helps. Resiliency and compassion satisfaction help to buffer, actually, our protective factors against burnout. Is when we feel that there is a satisfaction and contentment with what we do, that what we do has an impact, it's meaningful, and it's, of course, contributing to the organizational values. So those are very important and protective factors against burnout.
Rahaf, how have you changed your life to make sure you don't encounter another episode of burnout?
I think for me, the conversation was really around creative performance and recognizing that creativity and doing knowledge work is not something that can be measured through a productivity only model, meaning I can't measure the number of ideas I come up with every hour or the number of ideas I come up with a day, that I had to create different standards in recognizing that I needed to create systems that reflected how my creativity worked. So for example, if I spent the morning doing very highly intense, high cognitive skills like researching or writing or working on a client project, that if I needed to take a break, if I needed to take 2 hours to just do something else, that I could do that without feeling guilty that I wasn't at my desk hustling or pushing through. So the conversation here is really about how do we design systems that support creative performance? Because by sticking to legacy systems, by sticking to old systems of measuring success and performance that were designed for a type of work that no longer exists, we end up hindering our abilities to perform. So for me, it was internalizing this idea that floating or taking a break or taking a rest was a part of high performance, was a part of achieving a goal and not a diversion from it.
So we really have to give ourselves permission. Admittedly, we have no Protestants on the program here, but we have to give ourselves permission to step outside that so-called Protestant work ethic for a little while when we need to ensure that we don't burn out at the end of the day. Is that really where we're at?
Yes, I think it's just recognizing that if we want to do a certain type of work, we need to honor our own energy and our own, what the word was, I think, resilience and our own. We are not machines, so we cannot come to work every single day and do these highly intense cognitive tasks in the same way, 8 to 10 hours, sometimes 12 hours a day, nonstop, and not expect to have fluctuations in our energy levels and fluctuations in our concentration levels. We are not machines. We are human beings. So we need breaks and we need rest. And once you do those two things, the craziest part is your productivity goes up and your efficiency goes up and everything actually gets better. But we're so brainwashed to think that if we're not hustling or pushing through or burning the midnight oil, that we're somehow failing at being successful.
Dr. Kamkar, let me give you the last word, and I want to find out whether or not you actually practice what you preach. Because you're somebody, obviously, responsibilities at the University of Toronto, responsibilities at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. How do you make sure you don't burn out? Because I'm sure there's tons of demands on your time from all sorts of people.
You're right about that. I think for all of us, taking an individualized, balanced approach is so important. I always emphasize the importance of prioritizing all our responsibilities, and then whenever we are assigned new priorities, then again, reprioritizing, and very much accepting we cannot do everything all at once, which ultimately also drives and increases productivity. Setting a smooth transition from my work to our personal life, and also flexibility, which was very greatly mentioned, is flexibility, focusing on what we have control over, counting our positives and showing gratitude, setting meaningful activities for every day. But it also taking a healthy, balanced outlook in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our emotions, because when we are able to establish a very balanced outlook, we are able to make healthier decisions, healthier actions, and move forward.
Terrific. Rahaf Harfouch is the author of Hustle and Float, Reclaim Your Creativity and Thrive in a World Obsessed with Work, and Dr. Katy Kamkar, the clinical psychologist at CAMH, assistant professor at the U of T's Department of Psychiatry. It's been great having both of you on TVO tonight. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup à Paris.
Thank you so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.